In the winter of 1833, a livestock breeding ledger from Harrow Ridge Plantation in central Kentucky began documenting something that had nothing to do with cattle or horses. The handwriting belonged to Nathaniel Ashford, a 52-year-old widower who had inherited 890 acres and 63 enslaved people. But the columns that year showed an unusual notation system. Bloodlines tracked with the precision of thoroughbred stud records, projected offspring documented 3 years in advance, and codes corresponding to his own 3 sons, aged 19, 22, and 24. What the ledger reveals is a breeding program so methodical it operated less like agriculture and more like a controlled biological experiment, one that would consume the Ashford family from within. Nathaniel Ashford did not build his fortune. He married into it in 1809, taking the hand of Margaret Whitmore, whose father owned the largest tobacco operation in 3 counties. When the old man died in 1827, Nathaniel found himself master of an estate he had never expected to control, surrounded by ledgers he did not fully understand, and a workforce that had known him only as the son-in-law who spent most of his time in Louisville's gambling halls. The transition from dependent to patriarch happened overnight, and it changed something fundamental in the way Nathaniel saw the world and his place within it. For 18 years, Nathaniel had lived in the shadow of his father-in-law's authority, a man whose very presence commanded deference from everyone who entered Harrow Ridge. Old Samuel Whitmore had built the estate from nothing, transforming raw Kentucky wilderness into 890 acres of cultivated tobacco fields that stretched along the Salt River Valley like a green empire. He had done this through calculation, through careful management of resources both human and agricultural, and through an iron will that never bent to sentiment or doubt. Nathaniel had watched this man operate for nearly 2 decades, observing how power functioned when wielded without apology or hesitation. But Nathaniel himself had never possessed that same natural authority. He was the son of a failed merchant from Frankfort, educated enough to move in genteel circles, but lacking the capital or family connections to establish himself independently. His marriage to Margaret had been a rescue as much as a romance, and everyone at Harrow Ridge knew it. The enslaved people who worked the fields knew it. The overseers who managed day-to-day operations knew it. Even Margaret herself had known it, though she never spoke the truth aloud in all their years together. When Samuel Whitmore died, everything shifted. The estate passed to Margaret, and through her to Nathaniel as her husband. Suddenly, the man who had been peripheral to Harrow Ridge's operations found himself legally empowered to make every decision, to control every resource, to command every person who lived and worked on the property. The transformation was intoxicating. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel Ashford held absolute authority over something substantial, something that would outlive him if he could manage it properly. The problem was that Nathaniel had no talent for agriculture. He understood ledgers and numbers well enough, having spent years gambling and calculating odds in Louisville's card rooms, but he did not understand tobacco cultivation or the rhythms of planting and harvest. His attempts to modernize operations in those first years resulted in declining yields and growing debts. By 1830, Harrow Ridge was producing 30% less tobacco than it had under Samuel Whitmore's management, and neighboring planters had begun to whisper that the estate would be sold within a decade. It was during this period of declining agricultural productivity that Nathaniel began to recognize another form of increase, one that required no understanding of soil quality or weather patterns. The enslaved population at Harrow Ridge had grown from 47 people when he inherited the estate to 63 by 1832, and this growth had happened almost entirely through births rather than purchases. Children represented capital that appreciated over time, and unlike tobacco, they required no expertise to produce. All they required was control, opportunity, and a willingness to treat human reproduction as another column in the ledger. Nathaniel Ashford possessed all three qualities in abundance. Nathaniel's sons were born to different women, though all three carried his name. Thomas, the eldest, was Margaret's child, raised with the expectation of inheriting everything. William and Charles were born to a woman named Sarah, whom Margaret had tolerated in silence until her death in 1831. The boys grew up in the same house, ate at the same table, but carried the unspoken knowledge that their father saw them not as heirs to be nurtured, but as extensions of his will, instruments to be deployed when the time came. Thomas had been born in 1811, 2 years into Nathaniel and Margaret's marriage, arriving as proof that the union could produce the legitimate heir Samuel Whitmore had demanded. The boy was raised with every advantage the estate could provide. Tutors brought from Lexington, riding lessons, exposure to the accounting books and agricultural operations that would someday fall to him. Thomas learned to read Latin and French. He studied mathematics and history. By the time he was 20, he possessed the education of a gentleman and the bearing of someone born to command. But Thomas also possessed something his father had not anticipated, a conscience that occasionally troubled him. His years at college in Lexington had exposed him to ideas about gradual emancipation and moral reform that were beginning to circulate, even in Kentucky. He returned to Harrow Ridge in 1833 with vague notions that the estate could be managed differently, more humanely, though he lacked the courage or conviction to articulate exactly what that might mean. He saw the enslaved people who worked the fields as people rather than property. But this recognition existed in tension with his understanding that his entire future depended on their continued exploitation. It was a contradiction that would eventually break him. William and Charles, born in 1813 and 1816 respectively, were Sarah's sons. Their mother had been a housekeeper in Samuel Whitmore's household, a white woman of limited means who had attached herself to Nathaniel sometime around 1812, during one of his extended absences from Margaret's bed. The arrangement had been acknowledged but never formalized, and Sarah herself had occupied a strange middle space at Harrow Ridge, not quite servant, not quite mistress, tolerated because Margaret chose to tolerate her, rather than because she possessed any legitimate claim to be there. When Margaret died in 1831, Sarah must have believed her position would improve, that she might finally be recognized as Nathaniel's true companion. But Nathaniel had never seen her that way. Sarah died less than a year after Margaret, under circumstances the family never discussed, and her sons were left in their father's care with no mother to soften his expectations or shield them from his ambitions. William, the middle son, resembled his father most closely in temperament. He was charming when it suited him, calculating when charm failed, and utterly lacking in the moral hesitation that occasionally paralyzed Thomas. Where Thomas saw complications, William saw opportunities. Where Thomas questioned the system, William embraced it with the enthusiasm of someone who had never known enough security to develop the luxury of doubt. Charles, the youngest, remained the mystery. At 19 in 1833, he was still forming his understanding of the world and his place in it, still deciding what kind of man he would become. His father's breeding program would force him to make that decision sooner than he was ready. The breeding program did not begin with grand proclamations or written manifestos. It began in January 1833 with a single notation in a livestock ledger, a name followed by a projected date and a coded initial. Nathaniel had started tracking something he had been doing informally for years, but now he was bringing system and method to it. The handwriting was steady, businesslike, devoid of hesitation. This was not a man struggling with conscience. This was a man convinced he had discovered an efficient path to prosperity. The ledger itself was bound in dark leather, its pages thick and cream-colored, ruled with thin blue lines that created neat columns for recording data. Nathaniel had purchased it from a stationer in Louisville, intending to use it for tracking his horse breeding operations. He owned 7 horses in 1833, animals he had acquired with the vague notion of establishing Harrow Ridge as a center for thoroughbred racing stock. But the horses proved more difficult to manage than he had anticipated, their breeding cycles unpredictable, their temperaments unsuited to the casual oversight he was willing to provide. So the ledger sat mostly empty for the first few months after its purchase, pages waiting for information that never quite materialized in the volume Nathaniel had hoped. Then in January, he opened it again and began writing in a different kind of record entirely. The first entry appeared on January 14, 1833. Rachel, projected October, T. The notation was spare, clinical, stripped of any detail that might indicate this was documenting human reproduction rather than livestock management. In fact, that was precisely the point. Nathaniel had realized he could apply the same methodical tracking to enslaved women that he had intended for mares, and in doing so, he could project future increase with the same attention to detail that successful breeders brought to improving thoroughbred bloodlines. The second entry came 3 days later. Dinah, projected November, W. Then another on January 22nd. Esther, projected September, T. By the end of the month, 7 names appeared in the ledger, each followed by a projected birth month and a single initial. The initials corresponded to his sons: T for Thomas, W for William, C for Charles. What Nathaniel was documenting was not random occurrence but planned participation, a system he had evidently discussed with his sons before ever putting pen to paper. The handwriting reveals something about Nathaniel's state of mind during these initial entries. There are no crossed-out words, no hesitation marks, no signs that he paused to consider the moral implications of what he was recording. The letters are formed with the same confident precision he used when documenting tobacco sales or equipment purchases. This was simply another category of estate management, another resource to be tracked and optimized. The only unusual aspect was the need for discretion, the understanding that these records could never be shown to outsiders or discussed in polite company. But within the private confines of his own library, surrounded by account books and agricultural manuals, Nathaniel Ashford felt no shame about what he was documenting. He felt instead the satisfaction of a man who had identified an overlooked opportunity and developed a systematic approach to exploiting it. The ledger's first entries mark the moment when informal practice became formal policy, when opportunistic exploitation became calculated program. They mark, in other words, the point at which Nathaniel Ashford stopped being merely complicit in the horrors of slavery and became their active architect. By 1833, the domestic slave trade had become more profitable than cotton itself in certain regions of Kentucky. Children born into enslavement represented long-term capital, assets that could be sold, traded, or retained as the planters' needs evolved. Nathaniel understood these economics with absolute clarity. Every birth increased his net worth, and if he could engineer those births to occur with greater frequency and predictability, he could outpace his neighbors without expanding his land holdings or improving his agricultural methods. It was growth through biological control. The mathematics were straightforward enough for any planter with basic literacy to calculate. A healthy enslaved child, once reaching the age of 12 or 13, could be sold for anywhere between $400 and $700, depending on gender, perceived strength, and the current state of the market. But that same child, if retained and put to work on the plantation, would generate value through their labor for decades. The calculation became more complex when considering the costs of raising children to working age: food, clothing, basic shelter, the loss of productive labor from mothers during pregnancy and early childbearing years. Most planters approached this calculation passively, accepting whatever rate of natural increase occurred within their enslaved population and making economic decisions accordingly. But Nathaniel saw inefficiency in this passive approach. Why accept whatever increase happened naturally when he could actively engineer a higher rate of reproduction? Why leave something so fundamental to his estate's prosperity to chance? The inspiration had come from his brief, failed venture into horse breeding. Professional breeders did not simply allow their horses to mate randomly and hope for quality offspring. They selected specific mares and stallions based on bloodlines, conformation, and temperament. They planned breeding seasons to optimize timing. They kept meticulous records to track which pairings produced superior animals. Nathaniel recognized that the same principles could be applied to human beings, at least to human beings he owned and controlled absolutely. There was also another economic factor that made Kentucky particularly suited to this kind of systematic breeding operation. The state's position as a border state meant it served as a primary source for the domestic slave trade that supplied plantations in the Deep South. Traders regularly traveled through Kentucky, purchasing enslaved people to sell in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, where cotton cultivation created insatiable demand for labor. A planter in Kentucky who could reliably produce a surplus of young, healthy, enslaved people had access to a consistent market with steadily rising prices. Nathaniel kept careful track of these market conditions. His library contained copies of the Louisville Daily Journal, which published prices from recent slave auctions. He corresponded with traders who passed through the region, learning which qualities commanded premium prices and which characteristics lowered value. He discovered that light-skinned children often sold for slightly more than darker-skinned children, a grotesque premium placed on evidence of white ancestry. He learned that siblings sold together sometimes brought higher combined prices than siblings sold separately, because buyers believed family bonds made enslaved people more docile and easier to manage. Armed with this knowledge, Nathaniel began to see his sons not just as heirs, but as instruments of production. Thomas, William, and Charles were young, healthy, and under his complete authority. They lived on the estate and had daily access to the enslaved women who worked there. If Nathaniel could organize their participation in a breeding program, he could dramatically increase the estate's productive capacity without spending a single dollar on purchasing additional enslaved people from outside markets. The increase would be generated entirely through what he already owned: his son's biology and the bodies of the women he controlled. This was efficiency. This was modern plantation management. This was the future of Southern prosperity, or so Nathaniel convinced himself as he made his first entries in the breeding ledger and set in motion a program that would eventually destroy everything he hoped to build. Thomas, the eldest son, had been educated at a small college in Lexington and returned to Harrow Ridge with vague notions of reforming the estate's operations. He spoke carefully about modern agricultural techniques and diversifying crops. What he did not speak about was his father's expectation that he participate in the breeding program, an expectation that was never directly stated but communicated through silence, through the way his father would pause when passing certain cabins, through ledgers left open on the library desk. Thomas complied not because he believed in the system, but because refusal would have meant exile from the only world he knew. The first conversation between father and son about the breeding program never actually happened, at least not in any direct sense. Nathaniel did not sit Thomas down and explain his plans. He did not present arguments or justifications. Instead, he operated through implication and assumption, treating Thomas's participation as inevitable rather than optional. In January 1833, shortly after the first entries appeared in the ledger, Nathaniel began leaving the book open on his desk when Thomas entered the library. He would be standing at the window, looking out over the fields, and would gesture vaguely toward the desk as though inviting Thomas to examine the estate's records. Thomas saw his own initial beside women's names and projected dates. He understood immediately what was being documented and what his father expected, but the understanding came with no opportunity for refusal built into it. His father treated the matter as already settled, already in motion, a simple acknowledgement of activities that were occurring regardless of whether they were discussed aloud. And in this absence of direct confrontation, Thomas found himself trapped. To object would require him to name what was happening, to drag into explicit conversation something his father was deliberately keeping unspoken. It would require Thomas to be the one who shattered the careful pretense of normalcy, who forced a confrontation that might result in his permanent separation from the estate and the inheritance that represented his entire future. So Thomas said nothing. He saw the ledger entries and did not protest. When his father made certain suggestions about which cabins Thomas might visit on particular evenings, Thomas complied with the mechanical obedience of someone performing a distasteful chore. He told himself he was protecting his inheritance, securing his future, doing what was necessary to maintain his position. But underneath these rationalizations lived a growing shame that Thomas could neither acknowledge nor escape. The women his father directed him toward were not strangers. Thomas had known them his entire life. Rachel had worked in the main house when Thomas was a child, had prepared meals he ate, had cleaned rooms he occupied. Esther had been born on the plantation the same year Thomas went away to college. These were people whose names he knew, whose faces he recognized, whose humanity he could not entirely deny, no matter how hard he tried. And yet he participated in their exploitation, because the alternative was to give up everything he had been raised to expect. Thomas began drinking more heavily in the spring of 1833, a habit that would intensify over the following years. He took to spending long hours alone in his room, or riding the estate's boundaries in silence. When visitors came to Harrow Ridge, Thomas presented the polished exterior of a young gentleman prepared to inherit his father's property, but the facade grew thinner with each passing month. The ledger documented his biological contributions to the estate's increase, but it could not capture what the breeding program was doing to Thomas's understanding of himself. By 1835, Thomas had fathered at least 4 children according to his father's records, though he never acknowledged them as his own, and avoided looking at them when they appeared in the fields or near the slave quarters. He had become precisely what his father wanted him to be, a productive component in the estate's breeding operation, generating increase without complaint or resistance. But the cost of this compliance was Thomas's slow psychological dissolution, a process that would eventually culminate in his permanent departure from Harrow Ridge and his refusal to ever speak his father's name again. William, the middle son, approached his father's system with something close to genuine enthusiasm. He was 22 in 1833, unmarried, and possessed of the particular arrogance that comes from being raised with absolute power over others and no moral framework to check it. Where Thomas participated out of obligation, William participated out of appetite, and the distinction mattered. His father recognized this quality and began to favor him in ways that created tension between the brothers, tension that would eventually fracture the family entirely. William had never known the kind of security Thomas enjoyed. As Sarah's son rather than Margaret's, William had grown up understanding that his place at Harrow Ridge was contingent, dependent on his father's continued favor, rather than guaranteed by law or custom. This precarious position had shaped him in ways that made him simultaneously more desperate to prove his value and more willing to embrace whatever methods might secure his future. When his father introduced the breeding program, William saw it not as a moral horror, but as an opportunity to demonstrate his usefulness, to show that he was more valuable to the estate than his half-brother could ever be. The ledger entries reveal that William fathered more children than either of his brothers during the program's first 3 years. Where Thomas's initial appeared beside 7 names between 1833 and 1836, William's appeared beside 13. This was not accident or coincidence. William had thrown himself into his father's system with deliberate intensity, treating it as a competition he was determined to win. He visited the slave quarters more frequently than his brothers. He developed preferences and patterns that the enslaved community learned to recognize and dread. Nathaniel noticed William's enthusiasm and rewarded it. He began consulting with William about estate management decisions he had previously kept to himself. He gave William authority over some of the overseers, allowed him to make decisions about work assignments and resource allocation. Most significantly, Nathaniel began to hint that William might inherit a larger share of the estate than Thomas, despite the usual customs of primogeniture. These hints were never formalized in writing, but they were clear enough to William and devastating to Thomas when he overheard them. The favoritism created a poisonous dynamic between the brothers. Thomas, who had once seen William as an ally in navigating their father's difficult personality, now viewed him as a rival and a moral degenerate. William, who had always resented Thomas's secure position as the legitimate heir, now believed he was proving himself superior through his greater participation in the breeding program. The two men stopped speaking directly to each other by late 1834, communicating only through their father or through terse written notes left in the library. But William's enthusiasm came with a particular kind of moral blindness that made him dangerous in ways his father did not fully anticipate. William had convinced himself that the enslaved women at Harrow Ridge should be grateful for his attention, that he was somehow conferring a privilege on them by fathering children who would carry his blood even if they could never carry his name. This delusion allowed him to participate in the system without experiencing the guilt that was slowly destroying Thomas. But it also meant William had no internal mechanism for recognizing when he had gone too far. By 1836, there were whispers among the enslaved community about William's cruelty, about punishments he inflicted on women who showed insufficient enthusiasm for his visits, about his temper when he felt disrespected or refused. These whispers never reached his father's ears directly, but they created an atmosphere of fear that would eventually contribute to the program's collapse. William's enthusiasm, which Nathaniel had viewed as an asset to the system, was actually accelerating its self-destruction. Charles was 19 when the breeding program formalized, barely more than a boy himself, and yet his father expected the same participation as his older brothers. What the ledger reveals is that Charles fathered fewer children than his brothers during this period, but whether this was reluctance, inability, or simply youth is impossible to determine from the records alone. What is clear is that Charles left Harrow Ridge in 1836 and never returned, cutting all ties with his father and brothers, a departure that suggests he saw something in the system, or in himself, that he could not reconcile. Charles had been 14 when their mother Sarah died, still young enough to mourn her genuinely, and old enough to understand that her death left him completely vulnerable to his father's will. Unlike Thomas, who had Margaret's memory to shield him with at least the appearance of legitimacy, and unlike William, who had embraced his precarious position by making himself indispensable, Charles had no clear strategy for survival at Harrow Ridge. He was the youngest, the least formed, the most uncertain about who he was or what he might become. When the breeding program began in 1833, Charles was not yet 20. His father presented him with the same expectations given to his older brothers, but Charles responded with visible discomfort that he could not entirely hide. He spent long periods away from the main plantation, volunteering to accompany overseers to distant fields, finding excuses to travel to Louisville on estate business that did not strictly require his presence. The ledger shows his initial appearing beside only 3 names between 1833 and 1836, a marked contrast to William's 13 and Thomas's 7. Nathaniel interpreted this reluctance as weakness, as evidence that Charles lacked the masculine fortitude necessary to manage a successful plantation. He began excluding Charles from estate decisions, treating him with barely concealed contempt during family meals, making it clear that Charles was failing to meet the standards required of an Ashford son. This contempt only deepened Charles's alienation, creating a feedback loop where his reluctance to participate fully in the breeding program led to his marginalization, which in turn reinforced his sense that he did not belong at Harrow Ridge. But something happened in the spring of 1836 that changed Charles's reluctance into determination to leave. The ledger does not record what it was. Family letters from the period are vague, mentioning only that Charles had become difficult and unsuited to plantation life. Years later, after Charles had established himself in Ohio, working as a clerk in a dry goods store, he wrote a single letter to Thomas that survived in family archives. In it, he mentioned seeing something that made it impossible for him to remain at Harrow Ridge, something that forced him to choose between his soul and his inheritance. Charles chose his soul. He left in August 1836, taking nothing but the clothes he wore and $47 he had saved from a small allowance his father provided. He was 20 years old, leaving behind the only home he had ever known, accepting poverty and uncertainty rather than continuing to participate in a system that had become unbearable to him. His father never forgave the abandonment, never mentioned Charles's name again after his departure, and wrote him out of his will entirely. The question of what Charles saw or experienced in the spring of 1836 remains unanswered, but his departure stands as the clearest moral judgment anyone in the Ashford family ever rendered on Nathaniel's breeding program. A judgment rendered not through words but through the ultimate refusal, walking away and never returning. The ledger lists names with the brevity of inventory: Rachel, Dinah, Esther, Hannah, Mary, each followed by dates and initials. But names in columns cannot capture what these women endured. The psychological architecture of a system that reduced motherhood to production and turned their own bodies into sites of transaction they could not escape. Some of the women were teenagers, others were in their 30s. The only thing they shared was their complete lack of power to refuse what was happening to them, a powerlessness that was the entire foundation upon which Nathaniel's system depended. Rachel had been born at Harrow Ridge in 1805, making her 28 when her name first appeared in the breeding ledger. She had worked in the main house for most of her life, first as a child helping in the kitchen, later as a housekeeper responsible for maintaining the family's living quarters. She had known the Ashford sons since they were children, had watched them grow from boys into men, had served their meals and cleaned their rooms, and existed in that strange proximity that slavery created, where enslaved people knew the intimate details of white families' lives, but remained themselves unknowable, reduced to functions rather than recognized as fully human. When Thomas began visiting her cabin in the winter of 1833, Rachel understood immediately that refusal was impossible. She understood that her body had ceased to belong to her in even the limited sense that slavery had previously allowed. Before the breeding program, she had maintained some small sphere of privacy, some boundary around her physical self that existed, because white men at Harrow Ridge had not yet chosen to violate it. Now that boundary was gone, erased by Nathaniel Ashford's decision that increasing the enslaved population through systematic breeding was more profitable than relying on natural reproduction. The pregnancy that followed was documented in the ledger with the same clinical precision Nathaniel applied to all his records, but the ledger could not capture what Rachel experienced during those months: the complex mixture of dread and resignation, the knowledge that she was carrying a child who would be born into the same system that enslaved her, who would grow up knowing that his father was the young master who might someday own him. The baby, a boy, was born in October 1833, exactly when Nathaniel's projections said he would arrive. The accuracy of the prediction was proof of Nathaniel's control, evidence that he had reduced human reproduction to a formula he could calculate and manage. Dinah was younger, only 17 when her name appeared in the ledger beside William's initial. She had been born on a neighboring plantation and sold to Harrow Ridge in 1829, when her previous owner died, and his estate was liquidated. She worked in the tobacco fields, her hands developing the thick calluses that came from constant contact with the rough leaves and stems. She was quiet, careful to avoid attention, surviving through the strategy of making herself as invisible as possible to the white family, who controlled every aspect of her existence. But invisibility was not protection once Nathaniel's breeding program began. William noticed her anyway, or perhaps his father pointed her out, identified her as suitable for the system's purposes. She bore a child in November 1833, a girl who would grow up never knowing anything but slavery, never experiencing even the brief years of childhood that should have been hers by right. The ledger recorded the birth with satisfaction. Another asset acquired, another increase in the estate's value. Esther, Hannah, Mary, and the others whose names filled the ledger's columns over the next 4 years each carried their own stories, their own experiences of violation and forced motherhood. Some of them had children who survived. Others experienced miscarriages or stillbirths that the ledger noted with disappointment, as though the failure of their bodies to successfully produce enslaved children was a personal shortcoming, rather than a mercy. None of them had any choice in when they became pregnant, who fathered their children, or what would happen to those children once they were born. The breeding program transformed these women into instruments of production, but they remained human beings with consciousness and memory. They remembered everything. They knew the names of the men who violated them. They knew which children belonged to which fathers. And they passed this knowledge down to their children, creating an oral history that the Ashford family could never completely erase, no matter how thoroughly they buried the ledger. Nathaniel did not operate purely through coercion. He understood that systems function more smoothly when they incorporate reward alongside punishment. And so he developed an incentive structure that promised small privileges for cooperation, extra rations, lighter work assignments during pregnancy, occasionally a new dress or blanket. These were not acts of kindness. They were calibrations, adjustments to keep the system running efficiently. The horror was not that Nathaniel was a sadist, but that he was a pragmatist, a man who had reduced human reproduction to a series of inputs and outputs, costs and benefits. The incentive structure emerged gradually during the program's first year. Nathaniel observed that women who received slightly better treatment during pregnancy produced healthier children with higher survival rates. This was not a moral revelation, but an economic calculation. Dead infants represented wasted investment, months of reduced labor productivity, with no corresponding increase in the estate's enslaved population. If providing an extra ration of salt pork or exempting a pregnant woman from the heaviest field work increased the likelihood of a successful birth, then these small expenditures made sound business sense. So Nathaniel instructed his overseers to implement a tiered privilege system. Women who became pregnant under the breeding program received an additional meal each day during their final trimester, usually cornmeal mush or beans that would have otherwise gone to the pigs. They were reassigned from field labor to lighter tasks like spinning, weaving, or tending the vegetable gardens that supplied the slave quarters. After giving birth, they were allowed 6 weeks of reduced work before returning to full duties, a period of recovery that was generous by the standards of most plantations, but still brutally insufficient for women whose bodies had just endured childbirth. The incentives extended beyond practical matters of nutrition and rest. Nathaniel also understood the power of psychological manipulation, the way small gestures of apparent kindness could create complicated feelings of obligation and debt even in people who had every reason to hate him. He occasionally distributed lengths of cloth to women in the breeding program, fabric they could use to make new dresses for themselves or their children. He allowed some of them to keep small garden plots where they could grow vegetables to supplement their rations. These privileges were never formalized or guaranteed. They existed entirely at Nathaniel's discretion, could be withdrawn at any moment if he felt cooperation was insufficient. The cruelty of the incentive structure lay not just in its existence, but in what it required of the women subjected to it. By offering privileges in exchange for compliance, Nathaniel created a situation where women had to perform a kind of gratitude for their own exploitation. They had to appear willing, even eager, to participate in a system that violated them fundamentally. Any sign of resistance or resentment could result in the withdrawal of privileges and the imposition of harsher conditions not just for themselves, but for their existing children who might be sold away or punished as a means of ensuring the mother's future cooperation. Some women navigated this impossible situation by splitting themselves psychologically, separating their internal reality from the performance they presented to their white owners. They smiled when expected to smile, expressed thanks when given extra rations, and maintained a facade of compliance while nurturing an interior life of resistance and rage that could never be safely expressed. This splitting was itself a form of violence, a psychological fracture that the incentive structure forced upon them as the price of survival. Others broke under the weight of it. The plantation records note several instances of women who became difficult or melancholy during this period, plantation terminology that concealed deeper psychological collapse. One woman named Hannah stopped speaking entirely for 3 months after her second pregnancy under the breeding program. Another, whose name appears in the ledger as Mary, attempted to run away twice in 1834, an act of desperation rather than a realistic plan for escape. She was caught both times and punished, but the incentive structure meant her punishments were calibrated to avoid permanent damage to her reproductive capacity. Nathaniel's incentive structure was, in its own way, more insidious than simple brutality would have been. It created a system where enslaved women had to participate in their own exploitation, had to accept small mercies as though they were gifts, rather than manipulations, had to navigate an impossible ethical landscape where protecting their existing children often meant submitting to conditions that would create more children born into bondage. Harrow Ridge was not isolated. Other plantations surrounded it. Other families attended the same church, the same social gatherings. And yet no one spoke publicly about what was happening on Nathaniel Ashford's land, even though the evidence was visible to anyone who paid attention. The unusually high number of light-skinned children born in quick succession, the 3 sons who never married, but whose names appeared in baptismal records with alarming frequency. The silence was not ignorance. It was complicity, a collective agreement that certain truths would remain unspoken because speaking them would force a reckoning no one was prepared to face. The neighboring planters knew. They knew because they practiced their own variations of the same system, because the mixing of bloodlines was so common in the antebellum South that it had become an open secret everyone acknowledged privately, but no one discussed publicly. They knew because their wives knew, having observed the same patterns on their own estates and chosen to look away rather than confront their husbands. They knew because the evidence walked past them every Sunday when enslaved families brought children to be baptized at the county church, children whose features revealed parentage that official records never acknowledged. But knowing and speaking were different acts entirely, and the social structure of Kentucky plantation society depended on maintaining the distinction between them. To speak openly about what the Ashford sons were doing would require acknowledging that similar practices occurred throughout the region. It would require confronting the fundamental moral contradiction of a society that claimed Christian virtue while systematically exploiting enslaved women. It would require, in other words, a complete collapse of the carefully constructed facade that allowed wealthy white families to view themselves as civilized, honorable, and worthy of their elevated social position. So they remained silent. When Nathaniel Ashford attended social gatherings in the county, other planters greeted him with the same courtesy they always had. When Thomas, William, or Charles appeared in public, they were treated as respectable young men, future leaders of the community, despite the fact that everyone present could have counted on their fingers the number of enslaved children these men had fathered. The silence was maintained through deliberate collective effort, through social pressure that punished anyone who threatened to break it. There was one documented instance of someone attempting to breach this code of silence. In the spring of 1834, a visiting Presbyterian minister from Lexington delivered a sermon that included veiled references to the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, speaking in careful abstractions about the sins that wealthy men commit in the darkness and the children who cry out for justice from bondage. The sermon created a visible tension in the congregation. Several families left before the service concluded. Nathaniel Ashford himself walked out midway through, his sons following behind him. The minister was not invited to return. The church elders apologized to affected families for the discomfort caused by his inappropriate sermon. Within a month, the incident was forgotten, or at least never mentioned again in polite company. The message had been delivered clearly. There were truths that could not be spoken, not even in the house of God, not even by ordained clergy claiming to speak with moral authority. The social order depended on silence, and anyone who threatened that silence would be expelled from the community. This conspiracy of silence extended beyond the immediate neighborhood. County officials who maintained birth records accepted whatever information planters provided about enslaved children without investigation or question. Baptismal records listed fathers as unknown, even when everyone in the church could see the resemblance between the infant being baptized and the white man standing in the back pew. Newspaper editors who documented other aspects of plantation life carefully avoided any mention of the widespread sexual exploitation that undergirded the entire system. The silence was structural rather than individual. It was built into every institution that governed Kentucky society in the 1830s, woven into the fabric of law and custom and religious practice. It was maintained not because people were ignorant of what was happening, but precisely because they knew and chose collectively to pretend they did not. This was how the system perpetuated itself, not through secrecy, but through agreed-upon blindness, through a social contract that declared certain realities too dangerous to acknowledge even when they occurred in plain sight. What makes Nathaniel's ledger particularly chilling is its accuracy. He projected births 3 years in advance and was correct in 11 out of 14 cases documented between 1833 and 1836. This was not luck. This was evidence of a man who had systematized human reproduction with the same attention to detail he might have applied to crop rotation or livestock management. The projections reveal the depth of his control and the extent to which he had transformed human beings into predictable variables in his personal economic equation. The projections appeared in a separate section of the ledger, pages Nathaniel had titled Anticipated Increase 1833-1836. Each entry included a woman's name, the son whose participation was expected, and a projected month of birth calculated with remarkable precision. Nathaniel had clearly studied the biology of human reproduction, with the same diligence other planters brought to understanding tobacco cultivation or horse breeding. He knew that pregnancy typically lasted 9 months. He knew that women's bodies followed certain patterns and cycles. He knew, most disturbingly, exactly when his sons were visiting specific cabins in the slave quarters, information that allowed him to calculate conception dates with unsettling accuracy. The first projection appeared in January 1833. Rachel, anticipated delivery, October 1833, T. The baby arrived on October 12th, exactly within the time frame Nathaniel had predicted 9 months earlier. The second projection proved equally accurate. Dinah's child, fathered by William, was born in November 1833, again matching the ledger's prediction within a margin of mere days. By the time Nathaniel completed his first year of formal record-keeping, he had documented 6 births, 5 of which occurred within 2 weeks of their projected dates. This accuracy demonstrated something more disturbing than mere observational skill. It revealed that Nathaniel was not simply recording events as they happened, but actively orchestrating them. He was directing his sons to specific women at specific times, managing their participation in the breeding program with the same attention to scheduling and planning that a factory manager might bring to organizing production shifts. The projections were not predictions in any passive sense. They were plans, schedules, targets that Nathaniel expected his sons to meet through their compliance with his system. The 3 cases where projections proved inaccurate are themselves revealing. In one instance, a woman named Sarah was projected to give birth in March 1834, but no birth occurred. A marginal note in Nathaniel's handwriting explains, "Miscarriage, February." In another case, a projected birth for September 1834 occurred instead in October, a delay Nathaniel attributed to his initial miscalculation rather than any biological unpredictability. The third inaccurate projection involved a woman who became ill during pregnancy and delivered prematurely, resulting in an infant who survived only 3 days. What the projections reveal most clearly is that Nathaniel viewed human reproduction as a process he could master and control through sufficient attention to detail and systematic planning. The accuracy of his predictions became, in his mind, proof of his competence, evidence that he had discovered a method for optimizing the most intimate aspects of human existence. He kept the projection pages near the front of the ledger, consulted them regularly, and updated them quarterly with new entries that extended his planning horizon further into the future. By 1835, he was making projections for anticipated births in 1837, confident that his system would continue operating with the same mechanical precision it had demonstrated in its first years. 501 words. Something changed in the spring of 1837, though the ledger does not explicitly state what. The entries become irregular, less detailed, and several names that had appeared consistently simply vanish from the record. There are hints in the plantation's financial documents: an unusually large sale of enslaved people to a trader from Mississippi, a notation about disciplinary measures that carries no further detail, a gap of 6 weeks where no records were kept at all. Whatever happened that spring disrupted Nathaniel's system, but whether it was resistance, illness, or internal family conflict remains unclear. The last regular entry in the breeding ledger appears on March 3, 1837. It follows the same format Nathaniel had maintained for 4 years: a name, a projected date, an initial. But after March 3rd, the entries stop. The pages for late March and April are completely blank, an absence that stands in stark contrast to the meticulous record-keeping that preceded it. When entries resume in May, they are different in character, shorter and less confident, lacking the detailed projections that had defined the earlier pages. The financial records from this period reveal unusual transactions. On April 17, 1837, Nathaniel sold 12 enslaved people to a trader named Morrison, who specialized in supplying the Mississippi cotton plantations. The sale generated $4,800 in immediate capital, a substantial sum that suggests financial pressure may have played a role in the decision, but the timing is significant. Nathaniel had spent 4 years carefully building his enslaved population through systematic breeding, projecting future increase, treating human reproduction as a long-term investment strategy. The sudden sale of 12 people, including several women who had appeared regularly in the breeding ledger, represents a dramatic reversal of that strategy. Among those sold were Rachel and her 2 children, Dinah and her infant daughter, and a woman named Esther, who had given birth only 3 months earlier. The sale separated mothers from older children, in several cases a practice Nathaniel had previously avoided because he believed keeping families together made enslaved people more manageable and less likely to attempt escape. That he now disregarded this principle suggests either desperate financial circumstances or a loss of control over the plantation's operations. There is also a cryptic entry in the estate's account books dated April 23rd. Medical consultation, Dr. Hargrove, regarding incident of 14th Fiftuon. No further explanation appears. Dr. Hargrove was the physician who attended to white families in the county, not the person typically called for enslaved people's medical needs. The fact that Nathaniel paid for his services and documented the expense as related to an incident implies something serious occurred, something that required professional medical attention for someone in the Ashford family. Plantation correspondence from May 1837 includes a letter from Thomas to a cousin in Louisville, mentioning that he would be visiting the city for an extended period and did not know when he would return to Harrow Ridge. The letter's tone is terse, nearly hostile, a marked contrast to Thomas's previous correspondence, which had been cordial, if distant. Whatever happened in April had driven Thomas from the plantation, at least temporarily, and created a rift in the family that the remaining records never fully explain. By 1838, Thomas and William were no longer speaking to each other, and both had begun to challenge their father's authority in small but significant ways. Thomas questioned the estate's expenditures. William began disappearing for weeks at a time, returning drunk and hostile. The breeding program had created fractures within the family itself, resentments born from complicity and the unspoken knowledge that they had all participated in something that could not be undone or forgotten. Nathaniel's attempt to build a dynasty through blood had instead poisoned the relationships between the very people who were supposed to carry his legacy forward. The conflict had been building since 1834, when Nathaniel began openly favoring William over Thomas, but it reached crisis proportions in the aftermath of whatever happened in the spring of 1837. Thomas, who had always approached the breeding program with visible reluctance and growing shame, seemed to reach a breaking point. He began questioning his father's decisions in ways he had never dared before. During a family meeting in June 1838, documented in Nathaniel's personal journal, Thomas directly challenged the financial logic of the breeding program, arguing that it had not generated the prosperity his father had promised, and had instead created more expenses than revenue. Nathaniel's journal entry about this confrontation reveals his shock at Thomas's defiance. For 5 years, Thomas had complied with expectations, even as that compliance destroyed him psychologically. Now he was openly rebelling, calling the breeding program a moral catastrophe and a financial failure. Nathaniel responded by threatening to disinherit Thomas entirely, to leave the estate to William, who had proven himself more loyal and more willing to do what was necessary for the family's prosperity. William, meanwhile, was experiencing his own crisis, though it manifested differently, where Thomas turned his pain inward, developing depression and alcoholism. William turned his outward in increasingly erratic behavior. He began spending extended periods in Louisville, gambling away substantial sums and returning to Harrow Ridge only when he ran out of money. When present at the estate, he was volatile, prone to sudden rages, particularly toward enslaved people who he felt had shown him insufficient deference. The relationship between the brothers, which had been strained since 1834, deteriorated into open hostility by 1838. They avoided each other when possible and argued bitterly when forced together. Thomas blamed William for embracing their father's system with too much enthusiasm, for lacking any moral restraint or recognition of the humanity of the people they had exploited. William blamed Thomas for weakness, for developing a conscience at the exact moment when loyalty to their father was most important, for threatening the family's unity with his moral objections and emotional fragility. Nathaniel watched his sons destroy each other and seemed unable to recognize his own role in creating the conditions for this destruction. His journal entries from 1838 are filled with complaints about his sons' failures, their inability to manage their responsibilities, their ingratitude for everything he had tried to build. He never acknowledged that the breeding program had poisoned his family from within, that his attempt to use his sons as instruments of biological production had stripped away whatever genuine affection or loyalty might have existed between them. By the late 1830s, Harrow Ridge was populated by children who could see their fathers every day but could never speak to them as such, could never claim inheritance or acknowledge kinship. This was the psychological brutality at the system's core. Relationships that existed in biological fact but were denied in every social and legal sense. Some of these children grew up, were sold away, and carried with them the knowledge of their parentage into new lives where that truth meant nothing. Others remained on the plantation, navigating a world where their existence was both proof of exploitation and something no one could openly acknowledge. The oldest of these children, a boy named Samuel born in October 1833, was Rachel's son and Thomas's biological child. By 1838, Samuel was 5 years old, working alongside his mother in the main house, learning the skills that might make him valuable as a house servant rather than a field hand. He saw Thomas regularly, served him meals, cleaned his rooms, existed in that strange proximity that slavery created. But he could never call Thomas father, could never expect protection or affection or acknowledgement of their connection. The children learned early to navigate the impossible social landscape their existence created. They learned never to look too long at the white men who had fathered them, never to seek attention or recognition, never to presume any special status based on their lighter skin and obvious mixed ancestry. They learned that their resemblance to the Ashford sons was a dangerous truth that had to remain unspoken, that acknowledging it even obliquely could result in punishment for themselves and their mothers. Some of the children developed elaborate psychological mechanisms for managing the cognitive dissonance of their situation. They created internal narratives that separated biological parentage from real family, telling themselves that their true fathers were unknown or absent, that the white men they resembled were strangers despite genetic evidence to the contrary. Others could not maintain this separation and grew up with profound confusion about identity and belonging, never quite able to reconcile what they knew with what they were permitted to acknowledge. The mothers tried to protect their children from this psychological burden when possible, but protection was limited in a system designed to deny fundamental truths. Some mothers told their children nothing, hoping ignorance would spare them additional pain. Others told them everything, believing knowledge was a form of power, even when it could not change their circumstances. A few mothers whispered names in the darkness, ensuring their children knew who had fathered them, creating an oral record that could survive even if written documentation was destroyed. By the time the breeding program collapsed in 1837, at least 17 children had been born under its systematic operations. 17 human beings whose existence was direct result of Nathaniel's calculated exploitation. These children would grow up bearing the physical evidence of their origins, would navigate their lives knowing they were both family members and property, both Ashfords and enslaved. Their descendants would carry this knowledge forward through generations, some learning the full truth of their ancestry, others knowing only fragments, all of them shaped by a system that had tried to reduce human reproduction to entries in a ledger, but could never fully erase the humanity it sought to control. Margaret had died in 1831, 2 years before her husband formalized his breeding program, but her presence haunted Harrow Ridge in ways that shaped the estate's atmosphere. Servants spoke of her in hushed tones, as though she were watching from the windows of the main house. Whether Margaret had known about her husband's activities before, the program formalized, whether she had died mercifully ignorant or tragically aware, no one could say. But the timing of the ledger's first entries beginning so soon after her death suggests that Nathaniel had been waiting, that her absence removed the last restraint on his ambitions. Margaret Whitmore Ashford had been the daughter of Samuel Whitmore, the man who built Harrow Ridge from wilderness into prosperity. She had grown up understanding that she was heir to something substantial, that her marriage would determine who controlled the estate her father had spent his lifetime building. When she married Nathaniel in 1809, she was 19 years old, educated enough to manage a household, but sheltered enough to believe that marriage to a charming man from Frankfurt represented romantic destiny rather than calculated alliance. The marriage had not been happy, though Margaret maintained appearances with the same rigid discipline she brought to managing the household. She bore Thomas in 1811, providing the heir her father demanded, but there were no other children from their union. By the time Thomas was 5, Nathaniel had already begun his affair with Sarah, the housekeeper who would bear William and Charles. Margaret tolerated this arrangement with public silence and private suffering, understanding that her position depended on maintaining the facade of domestic harmony regardless of her husband's betrayals. What Margaret knew about Nathaniel's activities with enslaved women during her lifetime remains unknowable. The culture of plantation society encouraged white women to remain deliberately ignorant of their husbands' sexual exploitation of enslaved women, to look away and pretend not to see, even when the evidence appeared in the form of light-skinned children who bore unmistakable family resemblances. Some women managed this willful blindness successfully. Others were consumed by the knowledge they could not acknowledge. Margaret died in March 1831, officially of pneumonia, though some family letters hint at something more complicated. She had been increasingly withdrawn in her final years, spending long hours alone in her rooms, avoiding social gatherings she had once hosted with gracious efficiency. Her final letter to a cousin in Virginia speaks of exhaustion, of feeling that she had failed in some fundamental way, though she could not articulate what that failure entailed. After her death, enslaved people at Harrow Ridge began reporting that they saw Margaret's figure in the windows of the main house at night, watching the slave quarters with an expression they described as sorrowful. Whether these sightings reflected genuine supernatural belief or represented a way of articulating the ongoing presence of Margaret's moral judgment is impossible to determine. What is clear is that Margaret's memory became a kind of silent witness to everything that happened after her death, a presence that reminded everyone at Harrow Ridge that someone had once existed who might have prevented the breeding program if she had lived. Nathaniel never remarried after Margaret's death. He lived alone in the main house for 11 years, surrounded by the furniture and decorations Margaret had selected, eating meals at a table where her empty chair remained in place. Whether he felt guilt about pursuing his breeding program after her death, whether he sensed her watching him from those dark windows, his journals never reveal. Cecity. The Panic of 1837 sent shockwaves through Kentucky's agricultural economy, and by 1839, even established estates like Harrow Ridge were struggling. Nathaniel's breeding program, which had been designed to increase his wealth, now became a liability. Children required resources to feed, clothe, and maintain until they reached an age where they could be sold or put to work profitably. In a contracting economy, those resources became scarcer, and the human increase Nathaniel had so carefully engineered became mouths he could barely afford to feed. The system began to devour itself through its own success. The financial crisis manifested gradually at first. In 1837, tobacco prices began falling as credit contracted throughout the South. Banks that had extended generous loans to planters now demanded repayment or higher interest rates. Nathaniel, who had borrowed against future increase in his enslaved population, found himself caught between falling revenue and rising obligations. The ledger that had once represented his path to prosperity now documented a population he could not profitably maintain. By 1838, Harrow Ridge was operating at a loss. The tobacco harvest generated $3,400 in revenue, but expenses for the year totaled nearly $4,100. The deficit would have been manageable for a single season, but it extended into 1839 and showed no signs of improving. Nathaniel began selling off assets to cover operating costs: farm equipment, horses, parcels of land on the estate's periphery. Each sale reduced the plantation's productive capacity, creating a downward spiral where declining resources led to declining output, which necessitated further sales. The breeding program's children, who Nathaniel had projected as future assets, now represented immediate liabilities. The 17 children born between 1833 and 1837 ranged in age from 2 to 6 years old, too young to contribute significant labor but requiring food, clothing, and shelter. Nathaniel had calculated that these children would become profitable around age 12 or 13, either through their work or through sale to traders. But he had not anticipated an economic collapse that would make it difficult to feed them during the intervening years. The crisis forced Nathaniel to confront the fundamental flaw in his breeding program. It assumed stable or growing economic conditions where enslaved children represented appreciating capital. In a contracting economy, they represented costs that generated no immediate return. The system that had seemed so logical and efficient in 1833 now appeared as evidence of Nathaniel's miscalculation, his failure to anticipate that markets could collapse and take his carefully constructed plans down with them. Neighboring planners faced similar pressures, and many began selling enslaved people to traders who supplied the expanding cotton plantations of the Deep South. Prices for enslaved adults remained relatively stable because demand in Mississippi and Alabama stayed high, even as Kentucky's agricultural economy contracted. But prices for children dropped significantly. A 6-year-old who might have sold for $300 in 1836 now brought only $150 to $200, and even at those reduced prices, buyers were scarce. Nathaniel found himself trapped by the consequences of his own planning. He had engineered an increase in his enslaved population at exactly the wrong moment in the economic cycle, creating obligations he could not escape and assets he could not profitably liquidate. The breeding program, which was supposed to secure his prosperity, instead accelerated his financial decline. In October 1839, Nathaniel sold 23 enslaved people to settle debts, and among them were at least 7 of the children his sons had fathered. The sale records do not indicate which sons were affected, but family letters from that period reveal that Thomas left the plantation immediately afterward and refused to speak to his father for the remaining 3 years of Nathaniel's life. What had been an abstract system of exploitation became unbearably concrete when fathers watched their own biological children sold away like livestock, and the moral weight of what they had participated in finally became too heavy for at least one of them to bear. The sale was negotiated with a trader named Morrison, the same man who had purchased 12 people from Harrow Ridge in April 1837. Morrison specialized in supplying cotton plantations in Mississippi, where demand for labor remained high despite the economic crisis affecting Kentucky. He arrived at Harrow Ridge in early October with cash and a contract, prepared to select the people who would bring the highest prices in the Deep South markets. Nathaniel allowed Morrison to examine the enslaved population and make his selections based on commercial criteria: age, health, strength, temperament. Morrison chose primarily young adults and older children, people who could begin productive work immediately and had decades of labor ahead of them. Among his selections were Rachel and her 2 oldest children, one of whom was Thomas's biological son, now 6 years old. He also selected Dinah, William's biological daughter, who was approaching her 6th birthday. 5 other children fathered by the Ashford sons were included in the sale. The sale happened quickly, concluded in a single afternoon with money changing, hands and paperwork signed in Nathaniel's library. The enslaved people selected for sale were given a few hours to gather their minimal belongings before being loaded into Morrison's wagons for transport to a holding facility in Louisville. From there, they would be shipped downriver to Natchez and sold to plantation owners who would never know their origins, never know that some of these children carried the blood of a Kentucky family who had sold them into deeper slavery to settle debts. Thomas witnessed the sale from the main house, watching through the library window as Morrison's men organized the people who had been sold. He saw Rachel's son, the boy who looked so much like Thomas himself that the resemblance was undeniable, climbing into a wagon beside his mother. Something broke in Thomas at that moment, some final restraint or rationalization that had allowed him to participate in his father's system despite his moral reservations. He left Harrow Ridge that evening, taking only what he could carry, and rode to Louisville without saying goodbye to his father. A letter he wrote to William 3 weeks later preserved in family archives, makes clear that Thomas blamed Nathaniel not just for the sale, but for creating the entire system that made such sales possible, for engineering the births of children he knew might eventually need to be sold, for reducing human beings to financial instruments without regard for the biological and moral bonds that should have mattered. Thomas never returned to Harrow Ridge during his father's lifetime. He established himself in Louisville as a clerk, living in modest circumstances, cutting all ties with the estate that would have been his inheritance. Nathaniel Ashford died in January 1842 at age 61, surrounded by ledgers and records that documented a life's work he could not share with anyone. His final years were marked by isolation. Thomas had moved to Louisville. Charles had vanished entirely. William remained at Harrow Ridge but spent most of his time drinking and gambling, replicating the life his father had lived before inheriting the estate. The breeding program had ceased by 1840, not because Nathaniel had experienced a moral awakening, but because the economics no longer supported it, and his sons would no longer cooperate. He died having built nothing lasting, except trauma. The final entries in the breeding ledger appear in March 1840, documenting births that had been conceived before the program's collapse. After that, the pages remain blank, unfinished projections that would never be realized. Nathaniel continued maintaining other plantation records through 1841, documenting agricultural operations and financial transactions with the same meticulous attention to detail he had always brought to record-keeping. But the breeding ledger, the document that represented his grand plan for building prosperity through biological control, remained closed, on a shelf in his library, a monument to failure. William's presence at Harrow Ridge during these years provided no comfort. Father and son barely spoke, communicating primarily through notes left in the library or instructions delivered through overseers. William had transformed from his father's most enthusiastic participant into a bitter, angry man who blamed Nathaniel for everything that had gone wrong, including William's own moral degradation and the loss of his brothers. He drank heavily, starting each morning with whiskey and continuing throughout the day until he passed out in whatever room he happened to occupy. Nathaniel's health declined steadily through 1841. He developed a persistent cough that would not respond to treatment, lost weight, became increasingly frail. Dr. Hargrove visited regularly, but could offer little beyond laudanum for pain and vague reassurances that rest might help. Nathaniel spent his final months largely confined to his bedroom, attended by enslaved servants who had watched his rise and fall with expressions that revealed nothing. In December 1841, Nathaniel attempted to write a letter to Thomas, asking him to return to Harrow Ridge to discuss the estate's future. The letter, preserved in family papers, is barely coherent, the handwriting shaky and difficult to read. It speaks of regrets without naming them specifically, mentions disappointments without taking responsibility for creating them, asks for forgiveness without acknowledging what needs to be forgiven. Thomas never responded. The letter was found among Nathaniel's papers after his death, suggesting it may never have been sent. Nathaniel died on January 8, 1842, in the early morning hours. William was in the house, but not in the room when death came. The enslaved woman who attended Nathaniel in his final hours reported that he seemed agitated near the end, speaking names that made no sense to her, reaching for papers that were not there. He was buried in the family cemetery at Harrow Ridge, next to Margaret, under a stone that listed his birth and death dates and nothing more. No accomplishments were recorded, no legacy claimed. The breeding ledger that documented his greatest ambition remained hidden in the house, a secret his remaining family hoped would die with him. The ledger would be hidden. They did not destroy it, an omission that suggests some combination of guilt and the recognition that evidence of one's crimes is sometimes the only proof of one's existence. The ledger was placed in a trunk with other estate documents and stored in an attic, where it remained for 58 years until the house was sold. The family's instinct was correct. They knew the ledger told a story that would destroy whatever remained of the Ashford name if it ever became public. And so they chose silence, the same choice every neighboring family had made when they looked away from what was happening at Harrow Ridge. William made the decision about the ledger's fate shortly after his father's death. He found it in the library while sorting through Nathaniel's papers, preparing to settle the estate. Reading through its pages must have forced William to confront the full scope of what the family had done, to see documented in his father's neat handwriting the systematic exploitation that William himself had participated in with such enthusiasm. The ledger named names, projected dates, tracked bloodlines with clinical precision. It was evidence that could never be explained away or reinterpreted as anything other than what it was. But William did not burn it. Perhaps he understood that destroying the ledger would not erase what had happened, would not undo the children who existed as living proof of the Ashford family's crimes. Perhaps he felt some obscure obligation to preserve evidence of his father's life's work, even if that work was morally indefensible. Perhaps he simply could not bring himself to destroy something his father had created with such care and attention, despite understanding what it represented. Instead, William placed the ledger in a wooden trunk along with other plantation records, account books, correspondence, property deeds, documents that told the more mundane story of Harrow Ridge's operations. He locked the trunk and carried it to the attic of the main house, storing it in a far corner where it would not be disturbed by regular household activities. He told no one what the trunk contained or why it needed to be preserved in secret. The trunk remained in that attic through William's lifetime and beyond. William never married, never produced legitimate heirs, and died in 1868 at age 55 from complications of alcoholism. The estate passed to distant cousins who had never lived at Harrow Ridge, who knew the Ashford family only through reputation and incomplete stories. They inherited the house and land but showed little interest in the accumulated papers stored in the attic. In 1891, nearly 50 years after Nathaniel's death, the last Ashford descendant to own Harrow Ridge decided to sell the property. The new owners were a merchant family from Louisville with no connection to the old plantation aristocracy. They purchased Harrow Ridge as a country retreat, planning to modernize the house and transform it into something that reflected their own values rather than those of the vanished antebellum world. During renovations, workers found the trunk in the attic and asked what should be done with its contents. The new owners, not recognizing the significance of what they had discovered, donated the entire collection to a local historical society, believing the documents might have value for researchers studying Kentucky plantation history. The children born under Nathaniel's breeding program scattered across Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, and beyond as the domestic slave trade pulled them to new plantations and new lives. Some of their descendants eventually learned fragments of their origin stories, names without context, dates without explanation. Others knew nothing, the history erased as thoroughly as the Ashfords had tried to erase the ledger. But the biological legacy persisted, spreading through generations who would never know the full truth of how they came to exist, carrying forward the consequences of a system built on control, exploitation, and the terrible belief that human beings could be reduced to entries in an accounting book. Rachel's son, the boy fathered by Thomas and sold to Mississippi in 1839, grew up on a cotton plantation near Natchez. He worked the fields, married another enslaved woman, fathered children of his own. He died in 1889, having lived his entire adult life in freedom after emancipation, working as a sharecropper on land he would never own. His children knew he had been born in Kentucky, but they knew nothing about the Ashford family or the breeding program that had engineered his existence. The knowledge died with Rachel, who passed away in Mississippi in 1867, taking her secrets to an unmarked grave. Other children from the breeding program followed similar paths into obscurity. Some gained freedom during the Civil War and moved north, establishing new lives in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, places where their past could be left behind entirely. Others remained in the South, navigating the complex transition from slavery to sharecropping to the Jim Crow system that replaced formal bondage with new forms of control and exploitation. A few prospered modestly, acquiring small parcels of land or establishing businesses that served Black communities. Most struggled with poverty and the continuing effects of a system designed to ensure they would never have access to the resources and opportunities enjoyed by white families. The biological legacy of the breeding program manifested in physical features that marked descendants for generations. Light skin, particular facial structures, eye colors that seemed out of place in families otherwise marked by darker complexions. These features carried complicated meanings in African American communities, sometimes conferring small privileges, sometimes creating suspicion and resentment, always reminding people that the past was not past, that slavery's violations continued echoing through bodies and bloodlines long after legal emancipation. Some descendants, generations removed from Harrow Ridge, eventually learned fragments of their family histories through oral traditions preserved by grandmothers and great-grandmothers who refused to let the truth disappear entirely. They learned that their ancestors came from Kentucky, that there was white family somewhere in their past, that their existence resulted from violence and exploitation, even if the specific details remained unclear. This knowledge shaped their understanding of identity, of belonging, of the complicated reality of being descended from both enslaved and enslaver. The Ashford family name faded from prominence after Harrow Ridge was sold in 1891. Thomas's line died out. William left no legitimate descendants. Charles's fate remained unknown. By the early 20th century, the Ashfords were forgotten, just another family that had once owned land and people, but left no lasting mark on Kentucky history. But the descendants of the breeding program survived, carried forward the genetic legacy of Nathaniel's system, lived lives shaped by decisions made before they were born, by a ledger they would never see, and a man they would never know who had reduced their ancestors to projected increase in a livestock breeding record.